Welcome back, artists. I'm Waiya Paints, and today the good people over at SuperShark shot me over their latest sculpt of Wolverine to be the sponsor of this video. And you should have noticed from the thumbnail, I chose not to paint Logan in his classic colors. If that's got you wondering, we're gonna have to hop into the Wayback Machine to figure out why. I never want to paint yellow again, so I'm gonna put it out there now. Any requests for Sinestro or Reverse Flash will make me cry. And so just like George Michael, this year I'm gonna save me some tears. And I chose to go with this X-Force Black Ops suit. Not only does it save me from crying my eyes out, it comes with the added bonus of being super easy to touch up. And since it's going to feature so many blacks and grays, it gave me the perfect opportunity to use a really cool paint, Musou Black. There was a good 10 minutes a few years ago where it was the blackest paint you can get. While there are now a few more alternatives that are technically blacker, like Black 3.0, Musou has two distinct advantages. One, you can order it off of Amazon, so it's super easy to get it delivered to your door. And two, Stuart Simple doesn't end up with any of my money. Now, Wolverine may be the best at what he does, but what he doesn't do well is waiting around to get painted. So I'm gonna grab my brushes. Let's get started. As per usual, I'm starting with the base. And while this base was already sculpted with rock and snow textures, I wanted to add a bit more contrast by treating the snow like it's soil and then adding a texture paint on top of it to be snow. But first, I had a little bit of a layer shift that I needed to address with a bit of plastic putty. This really isn't a 100% fix, I just want to lessen the hard edge of the shift. So after laying down a bead of putty along the line, I quickly smoothed it down with the finger and left it to dry. After a couple of hours, it was looking ready for paint, starting with Uniform Gray. This was for the rocky bits, and while it is broken up with a secondary texture, I treated it as one big rock, so full saturation is a must before I move on. Next, I blocked in the dirt parts using Espresso Craft Paint. As I've mentioned before, paints marketed as for minis or hobby painting can be very expensive. So when I'm faced with large areas that need coverage, I like to reach for a craft paint when I can. The main drawback from using this paint more often is that it dries to a super matte finish, while most of my other model paints dry to a satin finish. Now, this can be mitigated by clear coating later, but that just sounds like extra steps, so I reserved this for areas I had already planned on completely washing. That way everything matches. Time for a bit of shading with Nuln Oil. This was used exclusively on the rocks to help define them. Just make sure you don't let this pool anywhere or you'll get coffee staining. In situations where time is money, having a small fan to speed up the dry time will be your best friend. But don't use this fan as a reason to overload your model. I get that it looks like I'm flooding the model with this type of brush, but the truth is, a medium makeup brush like this is fantastic for spreading out a wash and mopping up the excess. After I let it dry, I came back with a dry brush of Uniform Gray to re-establish the midtone and break up the shade a bit. Care must be taken here to not overdo this dry brush and lose all those fancy shadows. For the first stone highlight, Ash Gray. Using a medium dry brush here makes it easy to give edge highlighting to all the sculpted details. Just keep in mind, the idea here is to maintain the midtone and shadows. If you go too heavy, you'll lose both. Once the edges of the rocks get defined, you want to move to another area before you start to blow it out. Spaceship exterior is the final step for the rocks. This is a feather light application just to get the edges nice and crispy. I opted not to use this on most of the underside of the rocks, as they should be in shadow. While this observance is a small thing, being consistent with your lighting goes a long way to improving the final look of any piece. You may not be consciously aware of it, but subtle things like this add up in a very big way. With the rock side done, I had to go back and clean up any overpainting from the dry brushing and block in the soil spots that break up the rock face. This can be a bit tedious, but it's necessary to get the fidelity of nature's randomness just right. Thankfully, the model texture here is very clean and unambiguous, so it's pretty easy to discern what is what here. And the more you catch here, the better it'll end up. Next, I need to shade it all with sepia ink. Now, inks are very similar to washes, with one major difference, in that the tone is much stronger. So I only try to use these when they're going on an already dark surface, because using a regular wash would need 3 or 4 coats to properly shade it. Here, the ink is doing double duty though, as the craft paint I used dried too flat for my taste. This wash is not only going to darken it, but give it more of a satin finish as well. Time for a quick highlight with leather brown. This is a light dry brush just to bring out some of the surface texture. Now, I don't want to put too much effort into this step as a lot of this is going to be covered when I add the snow. But I do want the parts that do show to look good. So I devoted some quality minutes before I moved on to adding the snow. To add that snow, I'm using Snow Tex from Deco Art. Now, you can use Vallejo or Citadel texture paint for this. They are essentially the same. But with a statue this size, you're going to end up using a lot of it. Now, this jar cost me about $4 compared to the $12 to $16 I'd have to pay for a brand name. And seeing as it's just white paint with styrofoam pellets, there's no need to pay out the nose for it. When using a snow texture paint, you really want to build it up nice and fluffy. So you're going to end up using a lot more than you think. To apply it, just chunk it on wherever it belongs and try to smooth it in with the other clumps. Just don't push down too hard when you're smoothing or you'll lose those nice little mounds. For quick reference as to where it belongs, the more horizontal the surface is, the more likely it should have snow. The more vertical it is, the less snow it should have. For the cliffside of the rocks, I looked for any tiny shelves I can just put a little tuff of snow along the face. For the direwolf, I wanted to go for the blackest dog, so it's just a void with glowing eyes and teeth. Starting with the mouth, I used bloody red to block out the inside of the mouth and the tongue. Then I grabbed Toxic Boil. I used this slightly purplish pink to base the gums. I'm going on the light side here because with the small area that's getting painted, I want to try to up the contrast as much as possible. And the pink next to the black should really pop out at you. Time to shade it with Darucci Violet. This is a wash I don't get to use often, but when I do, it comes in clutch. Here, I put on like 3 coats to get it pretty dark, as a lot of dogs have random colorations in their gums, going from light pink to purple all the way to black. So don't be afraid to really push the shadows to the limit. Skeletal Bone is a fine choice to base the teeth. Not much going on here, just watch how much paint you have on your brush. Having just a bit too much can lead to you flooding the mouth and having to do a lot of cleanup. Also, don't forget to get the backside of the teeth as well. They are a pain, but they will be noticed. But if you decide not to, and somebody does notice, just tell them it's a stylistic choice. Because if you missed it, it's a mistake. But if you do it on purpose, then it's a paint style. Next up, for a bit of yellowing on the teeth, light tone. I know, surprise, surprise, Waiya's using light tone and skeletal bone together. What can I say? I'm a creature of habit. They look good together, and it's super easy to pull off. Just wash them down, then use thinned down skeletal bone to brighten them back up. It's easy and effective. If you wanted to, you can come back in with a second tone to lighten it up even further, but since this doggo is going to be super black, these are plenty bright. I then used that skeletal bone to block in the eyes. Again, a lighter gray is not really needed here, as all the black will have the effect of making these look white. After blocking out the irises with leather brown, I wanted to try to recreate the eye shine that wolves have at night, so I tagged in some Greta Gold to bling out the eyes. While this isn't exactly how it looks IRL, the reflectivity of the metallic is going to give me the feel of what I'm looking for. And once the eyelids get cleaned up, this will be really eye-catching. For the last step of the wolf, Musou Black. Now, this stuff can be a bit temperamental to work with. First, it dries really fast, so you don't want to work from your bottle or you'll get clumps in it. And straight out of the bottle, this stuff is pretty thick. It thins down well, but don't sweat over it too much. Due to the properties this paint has once it dries, you couldn't make brush strokes show up if you tried. The main issue with it is ensuring you've got even coverage, especially painting it over black. I had to go back and retouch this a lot. In fact, I spent more time touching up the black on the dog than the whole rest of the model combined. Mostly getting spots that didn't dry to the same finish as everything else, but partly to clean up where I touched it, as it seems if there's any oil on your fingers, this paint is going to grab onto it quick. So either wash your hands really well before, or use gloves. With 2/3 of this project already wrapped up, I figured this is a great time to take a moment to thank my subscribers over on Patreon. Month after month, your continued support is like a little voice in my head saying, "Keep going, do the thing, Waiya." If you would like to join the Painting Pantheon, you'll find a link to my Patreon in the description below. I'd also like to extend a special thank you to SuperShark, our sponsor of this video, for sending over their latest sculpt for me to print and paint. If you want to get your hands on this and many other top tier sculpts, be sure to check out that link below and take a look at their Patreon. Because from what I've seen, there isn't a single silver medal in the portfolio. It's all solid gold. So be sure to check them out. And if you do this STL, be sure to send me a picture because I'd love to show it off on the stream. But for now, there's plenty of painting to get done. Let's get back to it. Moving over to Wolverine himself, we have some nice variation to the textures used here, so it should be pretty easy to make it look great. It also came with a choice of 2 different heads for dealer's choice. I went with Logan's happy face. I just think he finds his joy in violence. So, happy face for the win. Now, even though I primed this in black, I went back over it with flat black just to make sure I had even coverage. Mainly because I don't want to get halfway into painting and find out that an armpit is naked resin. Hardened carapace was the next step up. Seeing as most of the suit is gray and black, I tried to keep this as simple for me as I could, so I started with the darker panels and worked my way up to the lighter grays. Carapace here is going to act as the highlight for the black parts, so a light dry brush was used to ease them up in brightness, just enough for the leather texture to be visible. The fabric panels got the same treatment, just with a bit more intensity. Next, I moved on to the uniform gray. First, as a whisper light dry brush to reinforce the previous highlight. The goal is to have this sit on top of the carapace, not smother it. You want this so light that it takes 5 or 6 strokes before you even notice a difference. Remember, the lighter the detail you're adding, the more work it will take to control how the paint comes off your brush. In this case, all the work happens before the brush even touches the model. Every time I reload the brush, I check the hairs to make sure that they're not clumping together, as it's a telltale sign that there's still too much moisture present to do what I need it to do. Keeping with the same paint, I switched to more of an overbrush to base the lighter panels. While you want to stay within the lines here, a bit of overspill won't really matter, so long as it's not excessive. This is just one of those perks that comes with painting in values. One thing I was mindful of was to have the color drop off as it approached the seams, which with a big brush can be pretty easy so long as you don't use too much pressure as to not force the bristles into the recesses. Next, to highlight the lighter panels, ash gray. Just like the highlights to the black, I went to my biggest floofy brush for a feather light dry brush. And once again, a bit of spillover is harmless. So long as you're diligent with checking your brush before you put it to the model, it'll just add a touch more to the peaks. And if you do go a little bit wonky and overpaint, we can clean it up in the next step. Time to shade with Nuln Oil. I ended up feeling like I took the highlights a little bit too close to the sun, and all the nice texture got lost, so an all-over wash was necessary. But this also made me feel I needed to wash the black panels as well, as I would end up gaining contrast on some panels while losing it overall between panels. If overshading happens here, it's fairly painless to dry brush up the highlights again. Working with values like this gives you plenty of wiggly room to push and pull your highlights until you're happy with them. Now these shoulder pads seem to be just hunks of steel bolted onto the suit, so that's going to be easy enough to handle with a bit of gunmetal. But I want this to be very tactical, so I mixed in some black ink to get a darker steel for the base. Just like with most of my true metal metallics, dry brushing over black is the simplest way to go. Most metallics are fairly thick, and to use them in a base coat would normally require judicious thinning. Otherwise, the chunky pigments will stack on each other unevenly and leave nasty brush strokes on the surface. To get that smooth, even reflectivity that reads like metal, a dry brush is second only to a rattle can. No painter should sleep on this technique. Since I had the metallics out, I used this darkened gunmetal to base the claws as well. Just being extra careful not to snag it on my brush, because these bad boys were prickly. Next up, plate mail. First used as a heavy highlight on the claws. Then, once my brush was almost completely tapped out, I went back to the shoulders to get a nice edge highlight on them. Now, technically, the rule of thumb is to paint inside out, so in this case, the skin then the shoulders. But since my metal technique is on the messy side, it's better to swap them here. A better final result trumps following by-the-book procedures any day. Finally, I was able to coax some silver out of this bottle for a bit of a super light edge highlighting on the claws. It only took a few minutes of very light dusting to have the claws looking dangerous. Now it's time for the skin, in two ways. First, the no fuss super simple way, starting with blonde shadow for the base. And dang, look at these arms! I knew Logan was a furry dude, but the hair on these pipes just makes me think he sweats pure testosterone. It does require a little bit more patience to get full coverage, but it's nothing too much to worry about. It'll take a few coats to get it nice and peachy. Just don't get antsy and put a ton of paint on thinking you can spread it all out. All of the sculpted hairs create little buckets that don't want to let go of paint once it gets in, which will then fill in all of the details. I've already simplified this down to 3 steps, so take your time with each step for good results. If you're confident with your brush control, you can switch over to a floofy brush for the second coat and treat it like an overbrush, though you might have to get a little stabby to get in the tighter spots. Once I had good coverage, I needed to handle these massive veins, so I stained them a bit with blue wash. You can also use a speed paint or contrast paint for this, or even a regular blue paint if you thin it down enough. Basically, you just want the underlying blonde to pass through the blue like a filter. And also, you don't have to paint the entire vein, just the majority of the top of it. Trying to paint the entire surface of the vein can just lead to overpainting and then more time spent to touch it up. I swapped over to cobalt skin as a final highlight. This was akin to a very heavy dry brush, as I wanted a semi-opaque layer over the large masses while skipping over the valleys. It might take an extra couple of passes to blend the vein in so that it looks like it's sitting just underneath the skin. You want to build this color up until you can't really make out the edges of the blue, but still see it on the peaks. And easy peasy lemon squeezy, the no fuss skin is done. But now for the high effort version, I'm going to need to break out the wet palette and 2 colors. blonde shadow, and crimson red. People have asked me how I do my mixes for skin tones, and honestly, it's super simple. First, I take a load of my darkest color to start my new color pool, and swirl off as much paint as I can. Then, without rinsing off the brush, I get a load of my lighter color. Then I give it a nice mix to check the tone. If I'm happy with it, without cleaning my brush, I'll use that color to start my next pool. I repeat this once or twice more until I have a nice range on my palette. Now step 1 is to base in the darkest color mix we have. This went on a lot faster than the first time, as it doesn't have the extra difficulty of trying to cover black, but I was sure to give them 2 coats for insurance. For the next color up, I started painting in the high points that need the most highlighting, then massaged it out towards the shadow areas. Unlike a face, where you have a lot of hard features really close together, the arms have much softer details, so the transition between the light and shadow needs to be softer over a larger area. If you find yourself with a hard edge on your highlight, mix a bit of water in with the color to make a thin glaze to blend out the transition. These same steps were then repeated with the next color, just over a smaller surface. And as you can notice, you don't even need a fancy or super sharp brush to do this. I'm using a 6-year-old Kolinsky that has seen better days. The scraggliness of the brush helps me get some really natural skin tone variations and not have to agonize over every stroke. But don't kick yourself if it's hard at first. It's a difficult thing to get a hang of, but given enough practice, you'll begin to get the feel of it, sort of like riding a bike. Then it becomes as simple as trusting your hands, brush, and paint to do what you want them to do. The following day, I picked up where I left off and painted his face in the same way, starting with a base of the darkest crimson blonde mix, then going step by step through each lighter color, focusing on more highlighted areas. But about halfway through, I made a slight detour to handle his teeth. Since the crimson is a decent color for the gums, I skipped ahead to just basing the teeth and skeletal bone. This is one of those times where the overspill from one area serves as the base for another. That's why it was a good idea to handle this now. Once all the teeth were down, I gave them a light wash of thinned down light tone. This is so the teeth have a bit of separation. Then I cleaned them up with a bit of the original skeletal bone. Although they've toned it down a bunch in recent days, Logan is a habitual cigar smoker, and while this healing factor prevents him from getting cancer, it does not stop the yellowing of his teeth. With the choppers down, I went back to finish up the skin, going through the remaining skin mixes. Following that, I painted up the lips. Starting with the darker colors, I painted successive layers on the lips until I hit a color that just fit well. I couldn't tell you what the percentage mix on this was, it was more of a feel thing. Once it felt right, I called it done. Now, I knew I wanted to incorporate Musou Black into the suit, as nothing says clandestine than void black. So I based dark portions of his mask, a few accent panels, his undies, and boot details. And just like with the wolf, I had to go back over this for the spots that didn't get the full coverage I needed for an even finish. Because while this stuff makes brush strokes a non-issue, getting 100% coverage everywhere will take a bit of due diligence. Now that the Musou was dry, I grabbed crimson to do all the piping on the outfit. Now, to the best of my knowledge, there isn't any accent colors outside of the X-Men insignia, but I felt it needed a contrasting color to add a bit of a design flair to the outfit. Using a darker red here keeps it within the realm of it being a tactical suit, while making it a bit more interesting to look at. I then used this same red for the infrared lenses on the cowl. No need to stress here, as cleanup with Musou is going to be as easy as it gets. For the second to last step, it was time to add some blood for the blood god. I kept this really straightforward. I see a cut, I fill a cut. Then I created a blood trail following the contours of the body towards the feet. And once it hit a seam, I just let it in. Then I repeated this for every cut and hole across the body. Now the only thing left to paint are the ninja stars and arrows that are stuck in Logan. Since I'm pretty sure he's fighting ninjas in this scene, black stars and black arrows was going to be the easy choice. But with all the black and gray that's used in the suit, they would just get lost. So I made a departure from what is logical and opted for silver throwing stars and gray shafted arrows with black felching. So the stars got based in plate mail, null and oil wash, and then dry brushed with silver, while the arrows were based in uniform gray, the feathers in hardened carapace, with a light dry brushing of ash for a highlight. All that was left was to glue it up and call it done. And holy amazeballs, this came out great! Big black void of a doggo, multi-texture base, and one scary happy Wolverine. If I were to change anything, I probably would opt for a different piping color. I'm not 100% sure what it would have been, maybe a blue or a purple, I don't know. But this crimson just keeps on blending with the blood and ultimately ends up feeling like he doesn't have enough blood on him. But what do you all think? Is it bloody enough, or you think I should have went even harder? Or maybe you think I should have had a good cry and then come and paint it the classic yellow. Let me know in the comments. I'm always down for a bit of critique. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. I know it's a bit annoying to be asked, but it's the easiest way to support the channel and make sure I'm able to devote the time it takes to make these videos. And finally, special thank you to SuperShark for sharing this STL and sponsoring this video. You can check out the Patreon in the link below to get your hands on this STL. You can also snag the Apocalypse and Scott Summer I've painted up on this channel as well. With all that said, I gotta get started on the next project. So as always, thank you for watching, stay creative, and always enjoy the process.